Hi, this is Peter Teuscher. I'm here with Tobi Demker. Thanks for joining us for another podcast where we pick a topic and see where the conversation takes us. We usually talk about personal development, professional development, and sometimes we throw in a little bit of philosophy. How you doing today, Tobi?
I'm doing good, thank you. I feel energized up to talking about stuff, so
Excellent.
I'm in
And
a good spot.
let's
Yourself?
yeah, good. Let's just hope we get through this without some technical glitches. I had some on calls yesterday, and our first attempt this morning was so it
Mm.
looks like Microsoft has a few issues, but fingers crossed it's going to stay stable for this podcast, and we'll get all our thoughts recorded before we have to log off. So you've got a great
Yeah,
topic
no,
for
that's
us
good.
today.
Yeah, well, before I don't know, we didn't talk about afterthoughts. Did you have any afterthoughts from our last session?
No, it sounds we've been kind of doing it sporadically. Um,
Yeah, I
so
guess.
to be honest with you, what was it? No, I do remember our last. We did the Seven Habits
Yeah,
from Stephen Covey. So no, I've thought about that one quite thoroughly in the past.
yeah.
So there was no more afterthoughts. What about you? Did you have some afterthoughts to the
Well,
Seven
it's just it,
Habits?
it well, very few really sort of specific afterthoughts, but it has crossed my mind very often. Like, what are the seven habits? I've been thinking about them, and I realized that I used to, when I lived in my house in Beijing before, I used to have like I think I made a drawing or a little poster of it, so I had it on the wall. And I thought I kind of missed that, just having it there makes you a little bit more conscious about what they are, and I think they're really helpful. And
Mm.
I've also, I mean, I've mentioned so many times about the intention setting that I do every morning with my family members, and it's just been in that kind of context. I've been thinking about the seven habits,
Ah,
and I
good.
still think it's really helpful. So I guess
Well,
I'm trying to live by it as much as I can.
I raised one of my the one that comes up the most often for me. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. It's a common one in
Mm.
communication, and it came up 2 days ago. I was with a client, and yeah, I mean, it's so relevant, and it comes up again and again. So yeah, for anyone who hasn't read the book, for the few who haven't read his book, it's
Mm.
definitely Dr. Stephen Covey, The Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
So, what do you want to talk about today?
All right. Yes. Well, today I thought we'd talk about leadership agility, whatever that means. The reason, I don't know if there's a particular reason why I chose the topic, but recently, in the last few years, everybody's talking about agility and the importance of being agile in business, in leadership, for organizational agility, strategic agility, whatever. So it's become kind of a buzzword. And maybe to start off with, I think that very often these kind of buzzwords is just like it's the same content in a new kind of packaging, and I think that's very often the case when it comes to sort of when we're talking about leadership trends. Now we have to talk about sustainable leadership or agile leadership. Or it's kind of, I mean, if you take the theories that have been around for a long time that are proven effective, there's just a little bit of a twist on that in a new format.
Hmm.
But when it comes to leadership agility, I've rediscovered a book that I read many years ago now. So maybe it's a little bit like your thing with with the Seven Habits, but it's a book by Bill Joyner and Stephen what's his name, Stephen Josephs, I think, called Leadership Agility, where they introduce a leadership agility compass, and there's a theory around how you can develop yourself as a leader, and it goes a lot in line with a lot of other theories around adult development with leadership development, etc. Um, but I think we could discuss leadership agility from a few different angles, and I will have that as a sort of a format to talk through what they mean about leadership agility, perhaps. Yeah.
No, that sounds great. And I think, on the podcast, we try and cover topics that cover people, in their personal development journey, but also in professional and organizational situations, because, that as coaches, that's, and we do a lot of training and, facilitation. So today let's do that. Let's focus on what makes people agile leaders. And I think maybe a good place to start is, what agile means to you. I mean, a lot of people, when they talk about agile, they think about like a process like Scrum or whatever, and different tools. And obviously agility is so much more than that, right? It's and this is a problem that people in organizations come across. They create a lot of these fixed processes, and they create rules. And when you deal with complex situations, the rules are too inflexible. So you have to work on principles rather than strict rules. And I think you can apply those same things to leadership, right? You can have a leadership style, but if you're too rigid, then you're not adaptable for every situation. So I think if we want to define what agility means, I think for me, it's the ability to adapt to different situations, to have a degree of flexibility, to be able to read a situation and apply the right tools for the situation or problem that you're trying to solve. And so I think those are the kind of words that I would use to describe the way I interpret agility, and how I would then apply that to, obviously, to leadership. And I've got a few ideas about that, but I'm interested in hearing you talk about the insights from the book, and then use that as maybe a platform to focus on it a little bit more deeply.
Okay, yeah, great. So I just want to connect to what you were saying as well. I mean, I also see, when it comes to agility, that it's really about being holistic and the ability to have to explore a lot of different thoughts and explore a lot of different possibilities. So rather than seeing things as either or, it's more as well as. And I think that's a really key aspect of when we're talking about agility, to be open to that there are a lot of possibilities that can happen at the same time. So it doesn't have to be black or white, and this kind of grayness to things. Maybe that sounds boring, but I think it's really fascinating to be able to explore how can you have different and sometimes maybe counterintuitive ideas at the same time, and both can be true. And it's about that kind of space. But anyway, we can come back to that. So when it comes to the leadership agility compass, they set out 4 different directions in this kind of framework. Where the first is, I don't know if there's a particular order, but it's first about the context setting agility. So thinking about what kind of context are you leading in now? What kind of context are you setting up for the people that you're leading with? How do you, what kind of direction are you setting out? And that has a lot to do with change as well, because the direction, obviously nowadays, they can change very fast. We've been able to go in this direction for a certain while, and then things happen, and then we have to be able to change that direction very quickly. So it's about setting the direction, but also the scope of the initiatives, the extent of the I guess the areas that we have to deal with. So where do we draw the boundaries? Okay, we can go this far, but not further. So, and that takes a lot of, when you think about that, it really takes a lot of thought work. So, who is saying that we have to put the line here? What if we did a little bit more or did a little bit less? And how do we work with that direction? And have an agility around that to take in different possibilities, to take in different perspectives from perhaps your team members or from others. It's a really important but difficult task when you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, so that's kind of the I would put that as the first sort of step. So what is the context that you're leading in? Thinking about direction and the scope of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things when I think about context that comes up for me is, and I've brought this up in coaching and in some of the trainings. that I've facilitated, and that is there are two psychologists from the U.S., although they have very German names, Tannenbaum and Schmidt. And they have
I thought they were German, actually.
yeah, so they're from California actually, but obviously with German heritage. But they have the leadership continuum. But so they really talk about understanding when you're in a leadership role, and part of the context is the level of experience and knowledge of the people that you're leading, right? So what can they handle? What level of responsibility? What kind of leadership style do you need to apply? And so when I talk about adaptability as part of your, being an agile leader, a lot of people will manage, or they'll lead in a way that they like to be led, or the way maybe leaders that have influenced them, or have that they've worked with in the past, that they respect. We often then use that in our leadership style, but it may not be applicable for everyone that we're trying to lead, or that's part of our management team. And so it's about recognizing that, and they have a continuum that really looks at experience and understanding and knowledge and so on, and then so the more experienced you are, the more hands off obviously you can be as a leader, and the more autonomy and freedom you can give them. And so there's an interesting way to look at it. You can put the leadership style in sort of 4 boxes. So you can have one being very kind of authoritarian, like you could relate it to like school. The teacher stands in front of the class. Of course, I think learning has changed over the years, but the old school kind of teachers at the front speaking, it's kind of one-way communication. There's not meant to be a lot of
military context, right?
Military as well. There's not a lot of interaction between the people listening. There's just one leader at the front who really gives direction and takes charge. Then sort of the next variation of that is kind of, if you imagine a leader sort of in a circle, still all the attention on the leader, but more interaction with others. And I relate that often to kind of a coaching situation. Like me having been a basketball coach, when we will do a drill and then I bring everybody in, and you kind of have the kids surround you, or the players, and you kind of look around the circle and you give feedback and that sort of thing. And so that's kind of when you're in teaching mode and so on. And then the third one is sort of, if you can imagine, look, this is just a representation, but if you imagine yourself as part of a circle, right? And this is when a lot of people, when I do leadership training, a lot of people, that's their preferred style, right? They like to be part of the team. They like to be part of that circle. And, everybody can talk to each other and there's interaction and you're one of many voices, but at the end of the day, you have the last say. And then sort of the fourth and final step is where you have the circle, which represents the people you're leading, and you give them all the autonomy, and you're outside the circle, right? So you can do the things that you're good at, and you can leave them to do the things that they need. So if you that's just trying to create a mental picture, but those sort of 4 stages where you have fairly authoritarian to very instructive, but still sort of control, to being part of the group where there's some autonomy and a lot of interaction, to there's complete autonomy and you kind of let them do what they're doing. And the thing is, though, there's a lot of people, today's managers don't like the military style. But when you think about it, there are situations where you need to, as a leader, be able to do that, right? In a case of an emergency, if there's a crisis, there's no time for debate and interactions. Like, somebody's got to take the leadership role and give direction, and there's one-way communication, and off you go. And then you can when you have a group of new young people, maybe you take the second style, and so on. So it's about, you have your preferred leadership style, but then you have other attributes that you need to bring to the surface depending on the context, as you say. And so that's a big part for me of being an agile leader.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
long-winded explanation, but yeah.
No, and it relates to this model in a really good way, because the next thing is about sort of stakeholder agility. So we can get in there a second, but more regarding that context. And I think that also has come up a lot lately, is talking about, well, understanding your context in terms of how multifaceted it is. I mean, how complex is it, or is it complicated, and how does that affect your decision style? And so if it's in a very sort of complicated system, or something that is difficult, challenging, but you can figure it out, then maybe you can take charge of that decision kind of making, and that maybe tends to one type of leadership. But in a different situation where you can't see all the aspects of the problem, and it's impossible to see it, then you have to sort of delegate more and get more inputs from others to be able to make decisions, or have other people that are closer to the problem to let them take the decisions, and you being accountable, etc. So it really, I mean, seeing the context for how you're leading in, depending on the situation, and it's really really key to how you make decisions, how you communicate with others, but setting the direction and understanding the situation that you're in. So I think it's really setting the foundation for how you want to act as leader. And I think it's really interesting also to think about, I mean, I have a lot of examples like that personally, when I've been doing one thing in a certain context and it's been going really well, and then I have the idea, oh, this is great, now I know how things works, and then I put myself in another context and I do the same thing, and I get completely different results. It just doesn't fit for this kind of context.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, well then I have to think about, how can I adapt in a situation that makes me more effective in this kind of context.
Yeah, and
so really having that in mind, maybe it sounds easy, but I think it's really
no, not at all.
Just that is a difficult task.
No, we get in our comfort zones or our ways of doing things, especially if we've had the same team for a while or the same people, and then if there's change, whenever we both worked with people on change management, and you have different ability to adapt to change. Some people, fight against it, and others embrace it. And so I think that's super important. I think the other context thing is where it's relevant is in communication. One of the key skills of good leaders is communicating well, and you won't use the same communication style with every context, right? If it's a conflict discussion, or if you're having, if you're communicating with maybe a leadership team above you, maybe you report into a board, or maybe you're on a board, and you within a certain context you will communicate differently than within another. And especially when it's, we've talked before about trust. Sometimes there are situations where being vulnerable is really important for developing trust within your team, but then in other situations it's just not appropriate, right? So I think that understanding your the communication style is also a really important part of being an agile leader, and knowing when to apply different styles or means of communicating. And being very adaptable that way. So I think that's another big piece of the context.
Yeah, and that is a perfect match to the best. I don't know as I said, I don't know if there's a particular order to the model, but one other aspect that I would go to is stakeholder agility, and it's really about understanding your stakeholders and resolving indifferences, or resolving maybe conflicts, or resolving pieces where you don't have the same understanding. So exactly what you were saying there. So who are your stakeholders, and how can you make sure that you understand the different types of needs that they might have and cater to them? And that means resolving issues, or resolving expectations, managing expectations, etc. through as is through understanding, through communication in different ways. So how does my kind of style serve this particular situation in the best way? So really having that overview. Okay, so I think it's really fun and interesting to work with stakeholder mapping, and just mapping out who are my stakeholders here and what are my connections, how close am I to different types of stakeholders, what kind of level of trust do I have with them, and how often do I speak to them. It's maybe some stakeholders I don't have in direct contact with, and they're indirect kind of stakeholders, but they're still really important to the output of my work. Now, so how do then where are the interfaces so I can communicate with those important stakeholders?
Oh, that's interesting. I actually have, so I use 3 steps for stakeholder analysis. I don't know if you have a process for it, but I so at least that's what when that's an issue that I'm using in coaching or in a workshop. But so there's 3 steps. So one, identifying who your stakeholders are. So recognizing what their level of influence and so on is. And it'll be different whether they're marketing or sales or engineering or whatever kind of part of your organization they are. So identifying them, based on their level of influence and contribution and so on, and then prioritize, and then prioritization. Obviously, that's done by the level of influence, the level of interest that they might have, how active they might be in a project that you're doing, and so on. And then the third step is really understanding, and to understand there are 3 key questions. So what motivates the stakeholder? So what motivations do they have? What interests are they trying to pursue? What agenda do they possibly have? And then, if let's say it's a project, then how does my project, or how does the goal that I'm trying to achieve or whatever, how does that fit into the priorities of that stakeholder? And then the third part of, in terms of understanding is, how can I how can I integrate the opinions or needs of that stakeholder into what I'm trying to achieve, right? So that's the understanding piece. So I don't know if you have any particular steps, but I am curious about when you say mapping out the stakeholders, because I actually use. Are you familiar with the power interest grid? It's like just a very simple four field matrix, right? But maybe we can talk about it for listeners who are interested. But there you can put your stakeholders into 4 different categories, right? And you can basically put them into this grid. It's a 4 field matrix. So on the one side you've got power and or whatever influence, like the power to make decisions, and then on the bottom axis you've got the level of interest, right? So so it's interesting on the power interest grid, you kind of define your stakeholders, and so the most important ones are are called players. So those are the people who can make or break your project, right? They've got a high level of influence on the project, and they also have a high level of interest. So that's why if you've got this 4 fields, they'd be on the top right? And so these are the people you really want to manage their expectations closely. You want to be really involved with them. Then if you move over sort of to the left of that, you've got the context setters, and those are people who they're kind of at the top level of an organization, the decision makers, department heads, that kind of stuff. They want low level of detail. They just break it down for me as simple as terms. So they actually have low interest, but they have a high power to make decisions and influence the project. Then if you move down to the bottom part of the matrix, the bottom right, you'd have what are referred to as the subjects, which I don't really like to use that term because it sounds a little bit derogatory, but the people who develop this power interest grid refer to them that way. But those are the ones who can advise you, but they don't have a lot of power to influence. So they're people that you that can be super valuable in terms of getting information and so on, but they just can't, they're not the decision makers. So they're important, and you want to keep them informed, and integrate them in that way into your project. And then sort of the last are the crowd. So these are the lowest priority stakeholders. These are the ones who have you really just want to monitor them. You don't need a lot of direct communication because they have the lowest level of interest and the lowest level of influence on the project. So I find this is a really, when because sometimes you get caught in a position when you're in a leadership role and you're managing, project or whatever, and you're part of a bigger organization. There are people who try and please everyone, and that's just not possible. So as part of this whole prioritization, I find the power interest grid really helpful because, you can spend a lot of time in communication, in trying to listen to everyone's opinions, and at the end of the day, you make no progress because you're trying to please everyone. And so breaking it down this way, I found a little bit helpful. I don't know if you use when you talk about mapping your stakeholders, if you have a similar process.
Yeah, well, I've seen the power interest grid. I don't actively use it. Typically, I just use what I call an ecosystem. So it's a very organic kind of drawing of what does it look like, and it's up to using your own creativity of how you want to draw your ecosystem. But you can use the locations on whatever you're using to sort of set out the distance and the level of intimacy you have with the different layers of stakeholders as well. I mean, you can use, I've used the onion as well to sort of like layer by layer to see where they are. In a more traditional sense, I guess RACI it can be suitable as well to identify, who is the accountable for this that you really have to lean to make all the decision, who's going to do the work, and who do you need to keep informed and consulted, etc. So, I think there's a lot of different tools you can utilize, but I think that the whole deal with the stakeholder agility is to first of all create an awareness of that you have different types of stakeholders and they will have different expectations and needs, etc. And then how do you deal with them in different ways that are effective? And having that notion that maybe there are more than one ways to interact with them and to deal with them. And if you send out an email to all the stakeholders, not everybody's going to read them, right? So yeah, just using different types of communicating with different types of stakeholders.
Exactly, and there's some people that you can send people emails, but on some people you want to give them a call, or you want to send them a personal message or whatever. But yeah, understanding your stakeholders and what they need and how you best communicate with them is super important.
Yeah. So that's kind of, we have context and we have stakeholder agility, and then the sort of southern tip of that compass, it's about the creative agility, and that's really about so analyzing the problems that you're having, but then also how creative can you be with your solutions. And I think this is really interesting to think about. I mean, when you think about analyzing things, it's kind of the logical, systemic way of, or sort of systemic way of breaking down problems and finding what is the root cause, etc. So how much of creativity do you have there in terms of balancing sort of your analytical ability with your intuition? And I think we've discussed intuition at various times in our series of conversations, and realized that your intuition is really powerful. So how can you utilize that? How much of the intuition versus your analytical ability can you utilize? But then also the other part of it is about how kind of creative are you with your solutions with the problems you have at hand. Having fun with it, trying different ways of things. And again, it comes back to that thing, I've tried this before, so this has to work. Well, is there other kinds of solutions? Are there other kinds of things that we could try, perhaps that I could try, but also, of course, to incorporate the team or the stakeholders that I have to come up with better solutions that serve all the stakeholders' interests in a better way. And for me here, it's you can have a lot of fun. I get excited just talking about this.
Absolutely. And I think, I come across people all the time and go, well, I'm not really a creative person. We're all creative. Creativity is something that's not just when you're trying to create art or something like that. There's creative problem solving and so on. And I think the more experienced we get, and the more, especially the longer we've worked in one specific field, the more we become somewhat rigid in how we want to apply things. So when you talk about I'm a big believer in intuition, but also sometimes our automated responses are very contextual. So if there's massive change, or you're put into a totally new situation, and you try to apply those old solutions or approaches to solutions, they won't work for you. So for some people, what they see as their intuition are the sort of automated responses. Through experience, they've developed a set of protocols that they use to address situations, and they're very applicable to a familiar situation, but they're more difficult in a new situation. And I think when you're very prone to see things through a certain lens, I think that's where. So that's why I'm glad that creativity is part of your model there, because that forces you to kind of take a step back, think about things in ways you hadn't before. Because creativity is all, we've talked about curiosity as well, and being this openness and being able to look at things from different perspectives, which is a really important piece of the systemic approach to things. And so I think it's interesting. I never thought of creativity as being an agile. I never made the direct association, so I think that's a really, and you make a really compelling case there for it, because we're in a fast-paced, changing world, and I think if you get too stuck in your ways of leading, then it takes you away from agile, your ability to be agile.
Yeah, you can definitely almost feel a strong correlation between agility and creativity.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
This has to go hand in. And in terms of innovation, so how if it's a crucial, we know that for all organizations, it's crucial to have that innovative edge, or to really to boost your innovation. And how can you utilize creativity to create more innovation within your organization?
Yeah.
And also thinking about, there's so many different aspects to think about risk taking. So how much risk are you willing to take, and how do you balance that risk? And it's you can bring in a lot of different facets to that kind of creativity to unleash and to create an atmosphere where creativity is allowed, yet managed perhaps in some way. So it goes into that direction that we've set out.
Yeah, and it's difficult for people who have a lean towards a more conservative mindset. It's always interesting when people think, often politically, when they think conservative, liberal, right? And really, when you come down to it, conservative are the people who want to, they like their traditions, they want to keep things the same. And then the liberal thinkers, they kind of embrace change more and so on. And it's obviously not black and white. You have a combination, and you need both of those qualities, right? To manage the pace of change, so it's not too quick and you're just not being super reactionary, but also to be liberal enough that you're willing to adapt and change, and you don't get stuck and left behind, sort of thing. So I think having a creative environment where you encourage those people who are a little bit more conservative in their thinking to also contribute and get involved in that creative process is super important. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah, and as you're saying, it's very much about engaging and creating context, or creating an environment where other people can thrive. And I can come back to this later, but there's another compelling case for how they see leadership development that has to do with this. But before I get there, we can talk about the last piece of the compass, perhaps. And this is something that we have talked about multiple times in our conversations, and it's about your self agility, and it's about seeking feedback and developing. Like it's particularly those aspects. So how can you make sure that you're doing well? How can you improve? Curious about your own sort of development, and then taking the time to reflect on that and see, okay, well, this is something that I want to continue to develop. So always, and I mean, for I guess for us that work with individual or personal development all the time, this is so it's so nice to see this. But the importance of having a curious mindset about yourself. How can you develop, and where do you get data to see what are your strengths, what are some development areas, so you can continue to develop within this kind of compass or format that you have.
Yeah, exactly. Because, especially when you deal with people that are higher up in the leadership hierarchy, they'll go, oh, that's interesting, but it doesn't apply to me, right? Or just like when we start talking about biases, and it's like, oh, I see those biases all the time, but I don't have those biases, right? So it's kind of interesting to have that piece in there to remind yourself that it can happen to us as well. When you say we address this stuff all the time because we work in this field, and I would say that I'm pretty self-reflective. But we all have our weaknesses, and we'll get stuck in no, that's not me, or we can't acknowledge certain things and about ourselves. And I think that's a really important piece. I think if you want to be, you always start with yourself, right? Being especially in a leadership role, being the best, achieving. That's one of the things I work with people on, is helping them find their own highest potential, right? And so no matter how much you've done this work, or how many courses you've taken, or how many years of experience you have, there are things that you are going to have overlooked, or that you've carried with you. And I think it's a really important thing to continually reflect and review, or sometimes you develop bad habits even later in life that don't support you, right? So having a process of reflection, I think, is good. So those are your four. That's interesting. The four elements.
That's the compass, yeah. The leadership agility compass. But it goes in hand with another very compelling kind of idea that they have, and this goes along with other work as well. If we're looking at full range leadership, I mean, you talked about Tannenbaum and Schmidt, but it's kind of the same thing. And if you look at Keegan's work about adult development and they have a similar kind of funnel where they go from, how can you go from being an expert leader to an achiever, to what we call a catalyst, and then there's other elements of it as well, like co-creator, etc. But what they are really focusing on is that in typical leadership development, that we become leaders because we're really good at something, right? We might be really good at solving these kind of problems, or analyzing that, or making budgets or whatever. And then if we're an expert in that area, then we become a leader and we can achieve greater things, perhaps. But what they are really focusing on here in their theory around the leadership agility compass is like, how can we become more of a catalyst? And what that means is really what you described before. How can we make others thrive? So we are not delivering the numbers, so to say, but we are creating an environment or a context where others can perform and create a bigger impact on the organization, the results from the society, or whatever we're dealing with. And that goes very much in hand with what we talked about before. So it's about developing not only ourselves, but very much about developing others, so that others can perform and grow, etc. And I think that's a really compelling part of leadership.
Yeah, when we talk about leadership in groups, it's interesting when you hear people who have kind of their role model, or someone they look up to in terms of, and you'll get the kind of popular ones, and Elon Musk is one that comes up often, because he is a visionary. He does a lot of leading by example, right? He has his desk in the middle of the production site, and so everybody can see him there. He puts in the most hours and so on. Leading by example can be a good way to lead sometimes, but it can be, if you're only leading by example, it can be very, very draining. It can be very exhausting.
Yeah.
And
I imagine it would be very exhausting working for him.
Oh, absolutely. Well, look, I've never experienced him. I've never had any direct contact with him, um, but it sounds like when I hear people talk about who've worked for the organization, that they really admire the guy, and so he does inspire people to follow, and I think he probably, when we've talked before about motivation, I think he gives people who have the skills the autonomy to be creative and pursue what they want to pursue, and they understand what their purpose is, so they can really see their contribution and so on. So I think there is probably a lot of that in the organization. Otherwise, he wouldn't have so many motivated, inspired. And when you hear about their technology, they're supposed to be miles ahead of any competition. So clearly, they've attracted the best people, and they've created an environment for those people to thrive. That doesn't mean that he's my best example of leadership, right? But there are certain things that he has for the industry that he's in that clearly are working, right? So
I'm not going to make any assumptions.
No, absolutely. So, but this is what I can assess from what I've heard from people who've worked for him, and sort of the kind of principles he's shared in interviews. So I think to get stuck in one type of leadership, I'm not sure that his leadership style would work in a lot of other organizations, right? So
perhaps.
Yeah. So but that's the whole point of it, is just recognizing where certain skill sets are really needed, and where maybe it's time to be a bit more adaptable, or in certain situations when to change, like we started the conversation with context.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you have any kind of leaders when, like, in relation to this, where you'd say they're a good role model or they're a great example? I mean, does anyone come to mind?
There are a few. I can't talk about leaders that I've had myself that are really in this way. I come across a lot of leaders in, for example, with clients and workshops. I come across a lot of leaders that I think they probably encompass this, but I don't know. I don't work with them. I see a presentation. I hear sort of secondhand stories of how they are doing this. So I can assume that they are, but I'm not going to put out any names here. That might be but I think it's. I came across one leader very recently who made that very clear about, and especially about, that there are expectations on you to you have to be this kind of role model if you're in this kind of position. And it was a situation where some very senior leaders kind of thought that, well, this doesn't apply to me because I'm at this level. But his response was that no, it applies even more to you because you're in this in this position. So you should have higher requirements on yourself. And then that created a certain atmosphere and a culture in the organization that thrives. That we take this serious, and we also need to, especially when it comes to the self-agility part, we also need to look for feedback. We also need to see where we can develop. And I think that that's a very common trait within a lot of really successful, not only leaders, but I think effective people, that they are very, very curious about how they can develop themselves. It becomes like a passion for them, that I want to learn more about it. And the past few days I've been sitting and going through some assessments with talents in a particular organization, and all of them are like really curious about what does this mean for me? What can I take away from this? And even though they've done similar kind of assessments and taking a lot of leadership training and development programs before, the passion and the interest to develop further is really there. And I think that's really interesting to see.
Yeah, and I think it's so important for organizations to recognize where their strong leaders are, because just a very recent case, someone who is actually moving to another organization didn't really want to leave. And but even went as far to come to the organization and say, look, I wouldn't have even looked elsewhere, but because I wasn't being heard and so on, but then it still came back to say, look, here's the offer. Do you guys want to match it? And there was just no interest. And I think and this is someone from my assessment is an extremely good leader, who attributes all, even for that when this person's team that they were managing had the best results of the employee survey of an organization that's going on to probably 3,500, 4,000 employees, right? And so to have those kind of to have great results, from a commercial standpoint, but also from the people standpoint and everything, and then to just let that kind of and then you have these. People are highest priority, and then the actions don't reflect the message, and so those are things that I think it's interesting when you have leaders that really demonstrate the ability to be agile, to communicate well, to manage stakeholders well, and all of the things we've talked about today, and then don't make attempts to retain someone who has very legitimate kind of requests and so that I think is really that's a shame when you as an organization don't recognize that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I mean, but so we've been speaking about leadership agility, and I guess I don't think there's a magic formula to it, but really taking a holistic approach and looking at all of these different things and thinking, and also that ability to keep different aspects of different perspectives in mind. So and that has to go with that willingness to continue to look for options and be curious about other options, and continue to develop that. Whatever has worked in the past, it's not necessarily going to work in the future. So what different kind of options are there, and creating a kind of curious mindset about that. So how can me and the people around me thrive in an environment that is always changing? And that can be kind of maybe a scary idea for some people, but I think for a lot of people that are embracing this sort of agile mindset, it becomes, the world becomes colorful and interesting and fun.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another thing I wanted to pick your brain on, what your thought was, but there's in the investment world. So when you talk about the stock market, people investing or trading or whatever, one of the principles is react, don't predict. Right? It's really hard to predict the stock market, and as a leader, it's really hard to predict behaviors, because they are contextual, right? So if you assume that people are going to react a certain way, you're taking some risk there. And so I think for me, part of being agile is the ability to react to different situations. So I was wondering, because I was kind of thinking about that. Can you apply that principle of react, don't predict? Because when we predict, sometimes a lot of times our biases kick in. We have certain expectations and so on, and we're maybe not in the moment assessing the situation and responding to that. Because I don't believe in being super reactionary. So that's why it's a hard one for me to get my head around, because for me, being reactionary is kind of, I believe in being proactive, but I sometimes associate being reactionary with somewhat in a negative way. So I was just wanted to throw that out there. What do you think about that principle of reacting to or responding to the situation at hand, rather than trying to predict?
I think, still, forecasting, setting direction, this kind of things is still very essential for business. And
Mm.
and when we talked about the context setting agility, that setting a direction and scoping is a very crucial part of it. And so we need purpose, we need direction. You know,
Yeah, for sure.
we've talked about these things before, so I think it's really important to have that. Yet the ability to react and to be nimble in that sense. So, and perhaps there's a difference now in the length that we're setting goals. I mean, and in traditional business, or traditional business, but I, one example is I was working with a German automotive manufacturer that was working with the Chinese IT company, and their goal setting scope was, the difference was like, we set goals for 5 years ahead. The Chinese IT companies said we have never set goals further than 3 months ahead. So there's a very big difference there. So how far you're setting your objectives? What does that direction look like? It's really important to have goals and objectives and direction to work towards,
Mm.
but then being nimble to change all the time, and to realize, and this is coming up again, and it's almost like like it's oversaid perhaps, but things are changing all the time. We're not going to stop changing. It's just going to keep going. So just be creating that agile mindset. So okay, let's just deal with it. And I
Yeah.
think we're getting a lot better at it. Now this might be early days, but I have a feeling like, okay, so we've gone through the pandemic. That was one of the biggest challenges that we've seen, and
For sure.
that it's created a lot of uh, sort of agile habits and a lot of positive outcomes in the way that we deal with stuff being nimble and fast to react in that sense. But then also when it comes to the recession that we probably have entered, I have a feel, as I said, this isn't maybe I don't know if this will be a right prediction, but I have a feeling that it's not going to be as bad as it could have been, because we have become better at adjusting and reacting in time. I mean, we're never going to know, but I think this could have been a lot deeper it would be happened earlier in history. So people always say that we don't learn anything from history. I strongly disagree. I think that we actually do.
Yeah, and the people say that history repeats, or some people say, but no, it doesn't. It rhymes.
Mm.
So, and I think it's always different. So I think you're right in some ways. I don't think we've seen the worst of it yet. So it's hard to say. But I think it'll be different from culture to culture, right? Because as you say, how you respond and how you deal with things is different in Asia, and probably different in Europe than it is in North America. So,
Mm.
so yeah, I think you're right. There's probably some good things and hopefully people will have learned from previous times we've been through this kind of stuff, but then we also, and this is why I brought up the whole react or respond, don't predict, because I know from coming from a business background, you make a plan, it's filled with assumptions, right?
Mm.
And then those assumptions, some of them were wrong. It's just like when you're modeling, right? When you're modeling too far in the future, all you need is one small error in your calculation, or just being somewhat off, and then over time, the longer out you try and predict the future, the greater the error is in the
Yeah.
assumptions that you've made. And so that's why I think obviously you need to plan, and you can't know, you don't have a crystal ball, so you don't know what everything that's going to happen in the future, but being agile enough to adapt and respond when you recognize, I assume that hasn't happened, now I need to pivot, rather than
Mm.
going, no, this is my plan, I'm gonna stick to it no matter what feedback I'm getting.
Mm.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of nuance there, that
Mm.
needs to be considered. So that's
Yeah,
interesting.
and I think that's the maybe I mentioned that, but being able to think in paradoxes, and I've read somewhere recently that when we're looking at narratives or models, I mean, we're seeing the world, or we're looking at a problem in one way, but at the same time, when we're using this kind of framework, looking we're also not seeing how something is. You know
Mm.
what I mean? So we're scoping ourselves, we're framing ourselves, so we're not seeing other parts of the things. So that ability to look at have different narratives, or looking at different models that are explaining the same thing, but from very different perspectives, and realizing that it's not that if this is true, this can't be true. Both can be true.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a really
and
good point.
yeah, and there's a book that I read called Diamonds, that I maybe mentioned before, and it's really about this. So how can you have two compelling but very different ideas in your head at the same time, and both can be true? They
Mm.
might be counterintuitive, but they can be true. And if you look at um, certain aspects of I mean, as we talked about decision making before, so if you're analytical and intuitive at the same time, what does that look like, right?
Mm.
So it's a big paradox, but there, if you can utilize both, you can probably create a lot better outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because in the world we're living in, and when you talk about stakeholders, and if I draw a parallel to things like geopolitics or whatever, the messages that you're getting, they have motivated reasoning. They may not be trying to deceive you, but they have a reason. There's a reason why they believe what they believe, and they're communicating a certain point of view, and they're really trying to convince you of that. And being able to have a degree of empathy, or like putting yourself in their shoes to try and see where their perspective is coming from, even if you totally disagree with it. I think that's a really powerful skill to have as a leader, and to be agile, because sometimes if you're too set in your perspective on things, and I think there's some danger, especially with the way we communicate, the way we get information. People get into their bubbles of information, right? They really especially because if you get information online, algorithms kind of try and feed you more of what you already are interested in, and so you really have to make an effort to step out of that, right? Whether it's the news you read or the type of people that you talk to, and that's why I think it's important to listen to contrary opinions, and really try and then you can really get yourself out of your own narrow band of information and way of thinking. So I agree that's a really important skill and a really important thing to reflect on and incorporate as you approach things in your organization or in the world at large.
Mm. Yeah, very challenging, but yeah, very
Yeah,
important.
it's not easy. It's not easy.
Uh. But it's
And
very interesting, yeah, and I think, yeah, part of that, again, part of that leadership agility is about that curiosity and openness to different ideas. I think that's a really key component of it.
yeah, and even someone you totally disagree with, trying to understand how they came to that conclusion, right? I think that's it's a really healthy process to get into, and one that will help you understand yourself and others a lot better, I think. So,
Yeah.
yeah, great. So,
All right. So yeah, have we covered enough around leadership agility? I mean, there's more to it that we
oh
can
yeah,
dig into, but at least we've covered the compass and looked at a few different aspects of it. And I think it was interesting to discuss it in this format, that we can just bring in whatever kind of ideas we have to the different parts of the compass. I think that was interesting.
yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great tool, and I'm going to consider that in the future. But yeah, I think it's a good topic, and we've kind of we've been talking a lot about personal development for the last few podcasts. So this is a nice one for people who want to have some work applications for this, because I mean this is the kind of the work we do when we do workshops and stuff anyway. So it's interesting to bring that into our forum. So thanks for bringing that topic. And it's been an interesting, and look, we've both been doing this for a while, and yet I still get new ideas from you, and so that's fantastic.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah.
So great. Well, look, let's wrap it up there. For all our listeners, thanks for tuning in for another podcast, and I hope this has been helpful. If you're a leader, then remember to be agile, remember to be adaptable, and you'll do yourself a favor and all the people that you're leading. And other than that, we'll be back in another 2 weeks with another topic and another discussion. So, Toby, thanks for that. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Peter.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.